Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David,
And I'm Matt.
and
We're the Taylor Bros.
we're the Taylor Bros. Yes, and we
Super
are
smooth.
currently not using artificial intelligence to write our episode scripts
No.
because we don't have any episode scripts.
Yes, true. We don't even have a full-blown intro and outro script. It's
No,
just kind
but
of a
we have
general
a
idea.
we have a general idea, and that general idea is get to it as quickly as possible.
Mm.
So, Matt, what are we talking about today?
He asked me as I'm about to take a drink.
Yeah.
Today we are talking about control and ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's what I think we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what we've briefly come to before we started actually talking. But I think it's an interesting concept for me, ownership and responsibility. I realized again recently, one of the reasons we're talking about this is because I realize when someone doesn't take responsibility, when someone doesn't take ownership of that situation, and instead they're using excuses or reasons, depending on how rationalizing they are for why they missed or they didn't do or they fell short of a deadline. Why that really irritates me. That idea of well, I've just got a list of excuses why I haven't done anything or and I was wrestling, well, why is that irritating for me? And I thought, well, partly it's because the flip side of that, a really high value for me, is growth, is development, is taking steps forward. And actually, if you are constantly coming up with reasons and excuses and um, things that
Self-justification.
justification, things that stop you from taking responsibility, you
Mm.
actually that's the biggest barrier to you developing, to you growing.
Mm.
And so I was just thinking, oh yeah, let's talk about ownership. Talk about responsibility. Let's talk about control versus excuses.
Yeah, I like that. That's really interesting. And I like how you have identified that perhaps behind one of the things that is behind your irritation with such behaviors, not taking ownership, is actually not because it affects me negatively, but it's because they are not living to a value that you hold dear and you hope for people. Part of your coaching, you want people to develop and grow. And if even outside of that context, that's still your desire for people. And if someone is clearly not doing that and they're exhibiting behaviors which are going to limit that, that's what great. It's because you're going, you're missing out. You're missing out. Yes, it's maybe there's challenge involved and there's pain points. Oh, but on the other side of those pain points, there's a whole world of like growth and amazing things that could happen.
Mm.
And I really like that that's the driving thing, at least one of the driving things behind the irritation. It's not just, ah, that's so frustrating because they're always coming up with excuses because that's annoying for me. It's like, no, they're missing out.
Yeah,
It's
and
really interesting.
to put it in a low stakes example, for example, I did a lot of sports coaching over the years, and we play for the same football team. I've got some football coaching badges. Now, if during or after a game I came and said, "Hey, Matt, like one of the things that would help you do better and help the team get better is, you know, making sure when you shoot, you hit the target." And then afterwards, you go, oh, do you know what? It was just the ground. Like I slipped. That doesn't normally happen. And da da da. And then the next game, you miss the target again. And it's like, well, Matt, one of the things you just got to do at this level is just hit the target. It doesn't matter if it's a perfect shot. And you're just like, well, I was just rushed a little bit. And actually you just never hit the target. And it's like, well, you stopped yourself getting better. You stopped the team
Yeah.
getting better because you're not taking responsibility of just like, oh yeah, actually I just need to calm down and hit the target and do that. And instead you hurt yourself and you hurt the team from getting better. And you think, well, how much more is that in, and imagine at a professional level if that happened, where the player just doesn't listen to the coach and was like, well, the reason this didn't happen is this, or they wouldn't last for very long, and they don't. But that you see that all the time in different organizations where it's like, well, why didn't you hit this target? Oh well, contractor didn't, and this didn't happen. And actually there's just this idea that, oh, I couldn't possibly take responsibility for someone else letting me down. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, not to maybe focus on the sports too much, but it's always an easy example or illustration. One of the things that I think I find most impressive about a manager like Jurgen Klopp, obviously we are Liverpool fans, so we like him anyway. But in his interviews and when they're just generally talking more about like what either happened in a game or over a longer stretch or even a season, he is so consistent in going basically when it goes wrong, it's my fault. I haven't done the job properly. I haven't communicated well enough to the players, the plan, or what and when it goes right, it's the coaches and them, and it's the players and it's them. And that record, it is effectively he's taking a position of ownership of when it goes badly and then pushing off the glory to others but you see the opposite of that, and you've seen that in certain managers where they will throw the player under the proverbial bus, or they will throw there was one instance where there was a Premier League boss who blamed one of the medical staff for coming on when one of the players had gone down injured, and then that player had to leave the pitch for a short period of time, and the manager blamed that medical staff for them losing the game, and you just go, that is the complete wrong approach. And of course, what happened is it alienated everyone. I think there ended up being legal proceedings and everything, a huge distraction, and it didn't help anyone. And so you just go, you can take the ownership approach, and it actually is a hard thing because sometimes maybe you are unjustly taking that ownership of the bad things. Maybe the player did make a complete mistake, or maybe they just did not listen to your instructions and you communicated clearly. But in doing that, you're giving a greater example and you're giving them the freedom to go, actually, the weight isn't all on you, it's on me. And so that's an example of that done really well, and leadership done well against one done not so well. Is there an example that you have, Dave, from your kind of personal life or professional, where you had to take ownership of something?
Oh, well, I wonder if you ever have to.
Interesting.
But I was actually thinking of an example because a number of years ago where I was sort of straddling two different jobs. I'd been given this responsibility to mentor a couple of guys on a volunteer program, and I would do like 1 week in one job, and then I transitioned to do another week or the next week in a different job, and I was back and forward for probably 2.5 months or so. So I would try and connect with these guys who I'd never met before, and I was trying to like meet with them, and I'd arrange time. So in that week, I'd like send out a bunch of emails, try and get to them, and then the next week I'd probably be like doing a night watch or something, and then I wouldn't be able to meet up with them. And this went on, and I was transitioning into the responsibility to take on not just two, but like responsibility for the next whole group, which was going to be like 25 people. Anyway, I never actually met with the guys, either of the two guys, and I got called into the manager's office, and the guy was like, "We're about to like give you this position. Like, why didn't you meet with these people?" And I just went, "Yeah, I didn't meet with them. I made a big mistake, and it won't happen again." And I basically, and he was angry. Like the manager was really angry at me, and afterwards I went out of the office. About 4 hours later, he called me back in. He said, "Well, look, you took responsibility. You didn't give me any excuses for why you didn't. So I'm going to trust you, and just don't let this happen again." And I didn't really realize it at the time. Probably he was deciding whether I'd even get that position. Actually, like suddenly that was up in the air. But my openness and just took responsibility, took ownership. There were loads of reasons why I didn't. I was straddling two departments. Neither of the guys ever answered any of my emails or anything like that. But ultimately, did I try my maximum? Probably not. I could have, gone and basically talked to their managers. I could have gone along to one of the trainings. There was a number of different things I could have done just to get that face-to-face connect and pin them down. And I didn't do everything I could have done. They didn't do anything. but that's, there was still more I could have done, and more
Yeah.
that I could have done that made that happen. And so I just owned it. I said, this didn't happen and it's on me. And that sort of saved me a little bit there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And how I think even though you could have given some, not excuses, but like justifiable reasons, that key of like, did you exhaust every possible avenue? If you did do that and it still didn't happen, well then I think you can say, hey, this isn't on me. Like I did everything. But
Mm.
but you
But
didn't
then,
do that.
but
And
even
so
then, I would say maybe my strategies were ineffective.
yeah,
Like
interesting.
maybe I should have just known a more, talk to somebody a bit. There's maybe I was just ineffective in my strategies. And as somebody who's taken that responsibility, it's my responsibility to make it happen. And if I saw it wasn't happening, I didn't communicate that to anybody at the time.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like actually, there's, unless it's like an impossible job, and even then, impossible things we think are impossible happen all the time.
Mm,
Someone is making developments or progressions in new research and new development and things like this. So even things that we said were impossible 10 years ago are possible now. So what is even impossible? And maybe it's just, so even if I did exhaust every known strategy I had, I could have included other people to help me solve that problem.
yeah.
And so there's just, I almost think, yeah, actually, there wasn't an equal effort from anybody involved in that. Like I put more effort in, but I didn't exhaust even close to what I could have done. So I had to
Mm,
take responsibility. I had to own that.
yeah, I like that. That's really interesting. In a sense, yeah, it's very easy. And I'm so quick to do this to come up with reasons why, like, oh, why didn't I achieve that, or why didn't I follow through with that, and you know. But when we give those reasons to someone, I think inherently everybody in the room knows what's going on. It's like, sure, that's a reason, but really, it's an excuse. At core, it's an excuse, and we are trying to excuse ourselves from having done it. But when you take ownership and you just go, you know what, actually, yeah, I should have done this. I committed to doing it, or I was asked to do it, and I didn't say no at the time. It's like I should have done it, and that already starts to diffuse um, or diffuse the situation. And just because at that point, people no longer have to go, oh, I have to basically show them that they haven't met their expectation. Oh, you recognize you didn't meet the expectation. Okay, well, yeah. And then really, it does become as simple as, okay, well, let's make sure that doesn't happen again.
Mm.
And maybe that looks like a conversation. Do we need to change the strategy? Do you need more support? What were the things that stopped you from moving forward? What can we remove the barriers?
Mm.
And at that point, you've become a collaborative space again. That ownership has now allowed you to re-enter into that connection rather than I'm excusing, I'm not taking ownership. You're still in loggerheads, you're in opposition, and in a sense, you're refusing to maybe be corrected, or to own up, to just say I didn't meet the expectation. uh, and when you do that, it allows for a fresh start. I think that's a cool thing.
Yeah, and I think often these things are in relation to other people, right? And the fallback is, well, I can't control what the other person is going to do, as if it's like I'm either someone who is controlling you or someone is completely helpless to what you do. As if there's nothing in the middle where I can be more effective in my people strategy, in how I've asked a question, in how I've reached out, and actually there's a broad range between totally controlling somebody and being totally helpless to what they're doing.
Mm,
And I think, so often it's like, well, they could have done anything. It's like, well, did you take the, and this is maybe where some of the Stephen Covey stuff comes into play with, you know, taking responsibility, but also how are you dealing with other people? Have you taken the time to understand them? Have you thought about how it's a win for them as well as a win for you? Or have you just gone
mm.
in and be like, right, you need to do this for me? Well, that's maybe not going to work very well.
Yeah, so interesting. I just there are some aspects in when you bring it into maybe a more relational sense, or other than a professional sense, but it works in both.
Mm.
Is that recognition of my responsibility is not how you behave or not how you respond. It's how I respond.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I like what you're saying as well there, though. I can, not in a way to try and manipulate, but in the way that I show up, it can determine how you show up.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, yeah, it's like you can say, "Oh, I can't control how they respond or how they show up." Well, if I come in shouting, there's a very good chance that someone can predict how they might respond.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I come in, more collaboratively and open and to diffuse any tension and just go, hey, this is my part in this, then you're already more likely to have an open response from the other person. And so it might be a family or an argument with your significant other or a family member. And if you come in and go, look, my responsibility here is how I respond.
But also
Yeah,
it is a professional sense. So, businesses work with other people, other businesses, with contractors. Like maybe you've got a contractor that works for the business and they're not working out the way you thought they would. Well, are you going to come in and be like, hey, why are you not doing this? Why is this not happening? You've missed on this and this and this. Or are you going to come down and have a conversation and go, well, what's going on here? Like, what are we missing? Oh, you're understaffed, and when we send the stuff to you is not how you can use it. Okay, so we need to do this to help you do this, and then it becomes a partnership, and it's not a me versus you. It's I've actually taken the time to like own this whole situation and take the time to understand your situation, which is going to help me help you, and rather than it being like I've come in. And so that's what I mean. It's like taking responsibility, it's taking ownership. But I think that's really difficult because there is a cost to that. I think the biggest cost is our ego and our pride, because when we make a mistake, we like to protect that. So we go, well, it wasn't that bad. We've all done it in a myriad of different ways. Again, in sports, I've missed open goals, I've missed penalties, I've missed chances, I've not tackled when I should have tackled, and afterwards it's like, wow, but it's a game. There was like 90 minutes. Anybody could have done anything else, but it's like, yeah, well, I can't necessarily control what anybody else did, but I know really I should have done better in my bits of the game, and that's why we've lost. And it's so easy to sort of like blame everybody else instead of taking ownership for my bit and ownership for how I can help other people get better. But in order to do that, it's like a big dose of like humility to be able to go, yeah, guys, sorry, I'm the reason we lost it. Like I've owned it. But if you do that, that sets a tone for other people to do that and go, hey, yeah, like actually, like I've sliced that clearance and I've messed up as well, and and it sets that example. And you'd much rather be in a team where everyone takes responsibility and ownership for themselves and for the team than a team that nobody takes responsibility for themselves or the team, where everyone's blaming everybody else and everyone's got excuses.
Hugely.
And
For me, there's been a absolute world of difference between certain projects that I've been part of, working as I have as a consultant. And it's so wonderful when the relationship between different parties is collaborative and there's just this openness to just go, you know what, actually, sorry, I haven't got round to that yet. I will get onto it, as soon as possible. That's just on me. There have been others where it's remarkable how nothing is ever their fault, and it's always posturing, and it's a case of like where you'll have some big bosses in this meeting, and they'll be trying to tell the narrative such that all of the problem is another party's problem, and you'll be in there and you'll be going, hang on, that's not actually what's gone on here. They'll be saying, oh, we haven't received any of this information, and someone else will pipe up and go, oh, hang on, no, we've sent that information 3 or 4 times to you, in multiple different formats across, and there's a paper trail and everything, and so it becomes this horrible game of like, whose fault is it? And you kind of go, at the end of the day, surely we should all be on it. Like, this is where taking ownership comes in. And Tim Elmore with the Growing Leaders podcast, they talk about one of their sort of one of their habit attitudes is this difference between, are you an owner or are you an employee? And just that difference of, the owner is the one that cares exactly where the tables and the chairs are, and exactly where, if you're a restaurant, and exactly where, like, the tone of the, the volume of the music and the taste of the food. The employee is just there to pick up a paycheck, and they'll do what they need to do, but they won't necessarily go above and beyond. And I think that's part, again, like we've spoken quite a lot in this discussion about taking ownership over when things maybe don't go well, taking ownership over mistakes, but there's also just taking ownership over every aspect of what you are doing. So in your work, take ownership and go, I want this to be excellent. I want to take, if I'm on a project and I'm not even necessarily leading that project, well, I'm going to take ownership of what I have and make sure, as you said, like, make sure that that's going well. And if something is starting to slide, or like, I'm not sure how to do it, who can I talk to? Who can I get advice from? What strategy do I need to maybe change? Or who do I need to talk to get that working? In relationships, if there's a problem in the relationship, take that ownership and don't necessarily go, well, I need to accept blame for everything that's going wrong, but to go, what's my part? And actually, how can I start showing up such that even if the other person isn't necessarily on board with taking ownership of their own stuff, the relationship will improve because, I'm inserting good, and I'm paying into that emotional bank account, or whatever. We've spoken about that before. So I quite like that, a bit broader. It's not just about taking ownership of, I made a mistake, although that's important. It's take ownership of the whole thing. Like, how can this be a win-win? How can this be brilliant?
Yeah, and I suppose it's not even just about the mistake, although I think taking ownership of the mistake is when the rubber meets the road sort of idea is. That's when it's tested. But that's also a bit in the post-mortem. That's when it's happened. And it's like, actually, I think you're thinking about like actually getting ahead of it, like taking responsibility, making sure it works out during the process, not just figuring out what went wrong after the fact.
Yeah.
And I was in preparation for this sort of conversation, I was remembering a story, and it was in IBM in the sort of 50s to 70s. I think it was Tom Watson, and someone tells this story about him where at that time a sort of a young executive had made several pretty bad decisions that had cost IBM several $1,000,000. So Tom Watson,
probably quite a lot in that day as well.
Well, it's quite a lot, whatever day of the week it is. I mean, it's still quite a lot, but and then, like 50 years ago, with whatever. Anyway, so Tom Watson, the sort of CEO, calls in the young executive, and the young executive goes, I suppose you're going to fire me for these mistakes that I've made and costing all this money. He said, no way, young man. We've just spent several $1,000,000 educating you.
Love that.
And it's a good
That's
story,
brilliant.
and it's quite a good line. And I think, but though it talks to the two sides of ownership. On the one side, he basically where he did own it, but also the owner didn't punish that mistake in the way that maybe we'd perceive most places would. And I think if some people, sometimes it's hard to take responsibility or ownership because we're punished ultimately, and it's not the good outcome. You don't get to keep the job, you don't get to do these things. And maybe that's not the best environment, but that is a reality for many of us, that actually we've got to hide our mistakes because mistakes are punished. And I think recently in one of these episodes you talked about a time when someone made this mistake. They broke the water filters on the ship, and they hid it. Oh, well, why did they hide it? Well, potentially because they were afraid of being punished. And actually the cost of being open and the cost of taking responsibility was higher than the cost of sort of hiding it, basically. I've lost the word there.
Obfuscating.
That's the one.
Not an easy word.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever said it out loud until I've just tried right then.
Nothing like doing it when you're on a podcast. Yeah, that's such a good point. I think, where did we learn to shirk responsibility and to take, to excuse and to try to self-justify? Maybe it's because we experienced, when you did take ownership, or when you maybe were caught doing something wrong, punishment was swift, and so you learn that wasn't good. I need to be absolved. And not through taking that ownership, but through not taking ownership. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
we
it's
fear.
protecting. I hide it. I push the blame. I don't take responsibility because the cost of doing that is too high. Personally, to my ego and my pride and my self-image, but also maybe like to my job position, to all of these other things. But I
Yeah,
would say on the flip side, there is a cost to not taking ownership and not taking responsibility. It's the cost of the very best. If I, in my relationships, don't take responsibility for them and ownership for how I show up, I'm not going to get the very best in those relationships because I'm not open. I'm trying to
yeah.
blame somebody else if we don't meet up, if something doesn't happen. I think ultimately, if I never take responsibility or ownership for what's going on, nobody trusts me. They're going to be like, you get too close to that person, they're going to blame you. They're going to throw you under the bus. So just don't trust them. Don't rely on them because they
Yeah.
are not trustworthy. They're not reliable, and they're going to blame you, and that's going to hurt. And so there's a real cost, I think, as well. Sometimes there's a cost to be taking responsibility and ownership, but there's a real cost as well, which is maybe less visible, of not taking ownership, of not taking responsibility.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah. So let us know what you think. How do you take responsibility? How do you take ownership? How do you respond to people that don't? We didn't really get into that. That's quite difficult, because ultimately it's like, well, I can take as much responsibility as I want, but will you? I don't really know the answer to that one. Anyway, until next week, thank you for joining us, and yeah.
Go make it count.